Father, thanks just for this body. You have brought the people that you have brought today. You know what's in their heart. You know what they need to hear. And we know that you're a God who wants to meet them, meet us right where we're at. So open our hearts, prepare us just to hear your voice, to feel your arms around us this morning. Pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Jennifer, bring up that first slide. From the Hound of Heaven. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinth ways of my own mind. And in the midst of tears, I hid from him and under running laughter. Up vistaed hopes I sped and shot, precipitated adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears from those strong feet that followed after. But with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat. And the voice beat more instant than the feet. All things betray thee, who betrayest me. And so begins a poem entitled The Hound of Heaven. The poem is actually 128 lines in length. It takes time to sort of decipher some of that 19th century English, but it's considered one of the greatest, perhaps most moving poems ever penned in the English language. Written autobiographically by a man named Francis Thompson, who struggled with poor health and depression and some suicidal ideation and an addiction to opium. But he penned the poem really at the end of a life spent running away from God. The title, which appears again in the poem, The Hound of Heaven, refers to the unrelenting love of Jesus in his pursuit of Francis. Jesus, the feet that followed, the voice that beat. And just consider that last line. All things betray thee, who betrayest me. All those things which we run after trying to fill that God-shaped void in our life, they will never satisfy, the poem is saying. They will betray us. They take us up vistaed hopes only for us to fall into titanic gloom. Because they betray us. They don't satisfy that hunger, that longing in our life when we flee from God, but God pursues us. Well, a little bit of culture to start our study this morning, because we are such a sophisticated group, aren't we? And a very fitting poem as we continue our study of Jonah. We began this just last week, so if you're just joining us, I'll catch you up. We saw Jonah fleeing from God, and we're going to begin again just at verse 1. Jonah, chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city, and make a mental note of that word great, because it comes up again and again in this chapter. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness, its evil has come up before me. God said, go, cry out, call out, preach against, deliver this warning of my impending judgment. Verse 3, but Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. We looked at this map last week just to get a little bit of geographical perspective. Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, that evil, evil world power at that time. It's 550 miles from Israel. God says, go to Nineveh. Jonah goes, exit stage left. He heads for Tarshish, 2,500 miles to the west. He flees from the mission God has given him because Jonah has just an intense hatred for the Assyrians, for the Ninevites. They're such wicked people. And Jonah knows, even though God says, go and preach judgment against them, he knows that God is merciful and loving and forgiving, and that God might relent from his statement that he's going to bring judgment. And so Jonah flees. But the Hound of heaven pursues the unrelenting God who loves even rebellious Jonah, pursues after him. We'll start anew now, verse 4. And then the Lord sent, and literally the Hebrew word is hurled. The Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm. And the word violent in the Hebrew text is actually the same word to describe the great city of Nineveh. There's the word. God now is doing great things. He hurls a great wind and a great storm. Such a great storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. Verse 5. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. These guys were experienced sailors. They had seen storms before. They don't panic easily, but they panic now. This was a different storm, and they were afraid. And I just want to draw your attention to 3 uses of that phrase in this story. 3 times the sailors are afraid or fearful, and each time it is a step towards coming to know the Lord. Initially, this emotion of fear is about the fear of circumstances. And so often, a person's first move towards God is just that. They're afraid of the storms of life that they are in at the moment. The storm has gotten their attention. Literally, the storm is rocking their boat. And that's what's happening. They come to an end of themselves, and in coming to that end, like the sailors, they cry out, each to their own God. Why did they do that? Because they want to survive. They're trying to survive. That is what storms do. The storms of life change your value system. You become focused on surviving, just making it through the storm. And so, verse 5, just flip back there. Verse 5, the sailors were so afraid, they take their cargo. And understand, that is their hope of economic gain. Perhaps even their one chance in life. This was a risky business, sailing across the sea. And this journey could have financially set them up. But they take that cargo, they throw it into the sea, and cry out to their God. Dramatic step. They're fearful of the circumstances, the storm of life. By the way, what's Jonah doing at this point? But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Now, this is tremendous irony, and the story of Jonah is so masterfully put together because there's so much irony in the story. But the irony is a pagan Gentile ship captain is now calling the man of God to pray. The captain is doing what prophets are supposed to be doing, and that is calling people to turn to God. But Jonah is sleeping. The scene reminds me of lyrics from an old Keith Green song. Well, that was my generation, Keith Green. But The song said, the church can't fight because it's asleep in the light. Jesus rose from the dead and you can't even get out of bed. There's Jonah. He's sleeping. And there's another incredibly well-crafted little piece here in these verses, because there's a repetition of a phrase. In the original Hebrew language, there's a repetition of the phrase, very intentional. We miss it in the English translation. But the captain's words, get up and call, is the same words, the same phrase God used to Jonah in verse 2 when he said, go and cry out. Get up, Jonah, and call out in judgment. Intentional repetition. Here's why, just to visualize the scene. Jonah is awakened from this deep sleep, and he hears the same words which God had so disturbed his life just a few days before. They're coming back to haunt him, to convict him of his disobedience. And so, rubbing his eyes in the grayness of that ship's hold, he wakes up, and Jonah sees, well, it's just the captain calling out to me, but his conscience is pricked. Jonah senses the hound of heaven pursuing after him. So Jonah follows the captain up to the rolling deck. The sailors are convinced that someone among their number has offended the gods, and like a magnet, that person has attracted this demonstration of divine anger. Verse 7. And then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots and find out who's responsible for this calamity. They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. God sovereignly uses even this pagan superstition to his own end. They cast dice, and Jonah is the winner, or the loser in this case. And verse 8, and so they ask him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? From what people are you? And Jonah answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. This terrified them. Literally, it says, and they feared a great fear. There's that word great again. And there's our word fear. They feared a great fear and asked him, what have you done? Now this is the second stage of fear. The first stage of fear was fear of circumstances, fear of the storm. Now it's, I'm going to call it a consequential fear. I'll explain it in just a moment, but let me give you some background information. Jonah, as all Jewish people were, is monotheistic. He believes in one God, okay? Hear, O Israel, your Lord is one. Worship the Lord, okay? But these sailors are polytheistic. Actually, a little more accurately, they're henotheistic, okay? Doesn't mean they worship chickens. Henotheistic, yes, is a belief that says there are localized gods, like tribal gods over different areas. And so you might have a god of the hills, or a god of the forest, or a god of the sea. And these gods are confined to precincts. One has power here, one has power over there. There's a god of Apple Valley, a god of Lakeville. Okay? And in fact, there's an illustration of that. Book of 1 Kings. The Syrians, that was a pagan group, they were defeated in battle. And this is what they say, 1 Kings. Their gods are the gods of the hills, so they're stronger than us. But if we fight against them on the plains, we will be stronger than them. See, their belief in these tribal gods. There's a god of the plains, that's our god, but we fought them in the hills, that's why we lost. Their gods are stronger. And so the sailors are crying out, each to their own god. They're calling out to any god they could. They're trying to hit the jackpot here. And then they hear Jonah say, my God is the God of heaven, everything. God of land and the God of sea. And when they heard that and knew that Jonah had ticked off their God, they're terrified. Terrified of the consequences. Okay. Once again, in the storm of life, at first we're afraid of the circumstances. We're afraid of the storm. But then sometimes we start to examine our own lifestyle. We start thinking, and rightly so, what are the consequences of my lifestyle? What will happen in the end if I were to die now? What would happen? Will I stand before a God who judges me, and how will he judge me? And often it's that sort of fear, not of the circumstances of life, but of the consequences eternally, that starts to drive us towards God. And we will experience consequences at the end of this life. There's heaven, there's hell, there's eternal life with God, there's eternal separation from God. That should produce fear. And some might argue, you know what, that hellfire brimstone sort of preaching is not a very good motivator in coming to God. And then others would respond, well, sometimes a good scare is better than good advice. Okay? And I understand the first response. There is a difference between external motivators and internal motivators. Okay? The difference of fear of consequences, that's an external motivator. I'm fearful of that final judgment, what happens at the end of life. If I love someone, if I love God, that's an internal motivator, okay? And that internal motivator is always stronger than an external motivator. But that explanation leads us actually to the third stage of fear, the third kind of fear revealed in the text. Continue on, verse 11. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. And so they asked Jonah, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up, throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land. And again, that's one of those little ironic twists in this tale. Remember, Jonah is so hateful towards the Assyrians, towards non-Jewish people. He's so nationalistic that he didn't want to take the good news to the Ninevites. He had no compassion on them. And yet in this story, here's the sailors showing compassion to Jonah. They risked their own life by attempting to row to shore to save him. And in contrast, it highlights Jonah's lack of compassion with the Gentiles' compassion, which then really highlights God's compassion, this God of a missionary heart. That's where we're headed in this story. It continues. But they could not. They attempted to row to shore, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. And then they cried out to the Lord. And notice, not each to his own God. They are now crying out to the Lord. Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man for you, Lord. Have done as you pleased. They're fearing the consequences still. They're fearing the consequences of displeasing God. Verse 15. And then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. Okay. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord. There's that word again, great, and fear. They greatly feared the Lord. This is now a reverential awe. Why did they greatly fear him? Because the storm was instantly calmed. This God, who was the God of heaven and the land and the sea, calmed the storm. It's like, oh. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, an act of worship, and made vows to him, an act of commitment, an act of devotion. Now again, you have to read Jonah and imagine it's the very first time you've ever read it. Even more, imagine that you're a Jewish reader. Because this is the last thing a Jewish person listening to this story or reading this story for the first time would ever expect to hear. This is unbelievable. A pagan boat becomes a place of worship. A ship of Tarshish becomes a temple of Israel's God. And they fear the Lord. The men greatly feared the Lord. This is not a fear of circumstances. Okay? There is no longer a storm. The sea is calm. This is not a fear of consequences. Jonah is dealing with the consequences. He's been thrown into the ocean. Now the sailors fear God. They have seen his power. The storm ceases. The sea is calm. It's like, whoa. It produces within them what the Bible calls a fear of the Lord. And that is a reverential awe, a respect for the Lord. That's what reverential fear is. The only sort of sense of scaredness in the fear of the Lord is, I don't want to dishonor him. I don't want to displease him. I'm fearful of perhaps doing that in my life. Fear of God, reverential awe, a respect, a love for. That's why the Proverbs say, a fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's a good thing. A fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. Very similar scene, Jonah, Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, disciples are in a boat, Sea of Galilee, storms arise very quickly on the Sea of Galilee as they're coming over the cliffs. Waves are breaking over the sides of the boat. They're fearful for their lives. And then Jesus rebukes the wind, and the sea instantly grows calm. Remember the story? Instantly grows calm. Whoa! Verse 41. They, the disciples, were terrified and asking each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Okay, now at that point, are they terrified of the circumstances? No, the sea has grown calm. The storm has been stilled. Are they terrified of the consequences? No, they're safe. The danger has passed. What they experienced, they were terrified. That it is a reverential sort of terror, a reverence for God. This is that moment, a whoa moment. The power, the presence of God is right there, and they saw that. And that's what the sailors are saying in Jonah. Who is this God who can send a great storm and then calm the sea? What an awesome, powerful God. And again, how odd to all the readers of this story in Israel. At this point, pagan Gentiles worshiping the God of Israel. And Israel's prophet, the man of God, the supposed hero of the story, he's sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Okay? But even there, the Hound of heaven, in his unrelenting love, continues to pursue Jonah. And that's where we're going to continue next week. Let me give you an easy way to remember chapter 1. Here's the summary. God says, go. Jonah says, no. God says, blow. Jonah says, throw. And the sailors go, whoa. Okay. And that is, oh, no. You're going to do this just in a minute. Okay. The sailors said, whoa, what an awesome God. And that's the intent of the entire book. That's the purpose that the book was written. It's not about Jonah. It's not about a great fish. It's about this great God that we have. Whoa, what a great God. God said go. Jonah said no. Why did he say no? Remember? I've told you once, last week we looked at it, we peeked ahead, because Jonah knows God is merciful, loving, forgiving. You said, God, you were going to bring judgment on Nineveh, these wicked people. I hate those people. But God, I know you, and you are a forgiving, loving God. You're going to relent. You're not going to bring judgment on them. I know that. Jonah flees. God says go. Jonah says no. God says blow, producing fear of circumstances. Jonah says throw, producing a fear of consequences in the sailors. And then God stills the storm, and the sailors said, whoa, what an awesome God, this God of Israel. Okay, do that with me. God said, no. Jonah said, no. God said, no. Jonah said, no. And the sailors said, and you really got to do this, you really got to do this. And the sailors said, whoa. That's Jonah chapter 1. Closing thought. It is never too late to quit running from God. And maybe you are running now in very obvious ways. Maybe you're running in secret, hidden ways. Maybe there is a storm that is hit and you're in the midst of the storm right now. And please understand, not all storms in life are because you're disobedient. We'll talk more about storms next week. Maybe you're in the midst of the storm. Maybe you can see the storm on the horizon. The application from Jonah is, however, don't wait for the storm to get worse. God always extends this invitation, come to me. And in fact, God will pursue after us. And he will get our attention, even if it takes the storm, because our God is the Hound of heaven. Right? Let's pray. Worship team. Gracious God, thank you for your word. And help us just fall in love with your word and understand that you still speak to us today. Give us ears to hear and hearts to receive. Right now, you know, each one of us, somewhere in the course of life, we are. If we're running from that storm, give us just the strength to stop and to run back to you. And open our eyes to understand. Loving, merciful, forgiving, compassionate God. And produce a whoa in our life for you. In Jesus' name. Hey, let's stand and sing our closing song. Get you out of here to have a relaxing out.